Hello, and welcome to the latest episode of The Invisible Men. My name is Ian Nique. Great to see you.
Great to see you, Ian. So excited to have a returning guest on, one of our most popular guests. And one of the things I did before this episode is I went back and looked at all the comments from the first time Mr. Riley was on, and people loved him. And I'm even going to quote from one of the comments to ask him a question a little bit later. So,
Oh, no.
welcome, Jason.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you for having me, both of you. Hope you're well.
Yes. Well, Jason Riley, for those of our audience who have not become familiar with Jason's work, Jason is a senior fellow at the Manhattan Institute, a columnist for the Wall Street Journal, prolific author with great titles, Please Stop Helping Us, which I've often thought is one of the greatest book titles. And then, of course, there's Maverick by Thomas Sowell. But we're primarily here, Jason, to talk about your latest book, The Affirmative Action Myth. And so rather than us summarize, tell us, what is the myth? What is this thing called affirmative action that we seem to hold so dear?
Sure. Well, the impetus for the book was the discussion around the Supreme Court ruling in 2023 in Students for Fair Admissions versus Harvard, which banned racial preferences in college admissions. And it was a not particularly surprising ruling. People who follow the court looked at the makeup of the justices and said, the days are probably numbered for these policies. But there was this sort of apocalyptic chatter, this doomsaying surrounding the decision, particularly coming from black elites on the left, who said, this is going to decimate the black middle class.
Yeah.
Racial preferences created the black middle class in this country, and without affirmative action, college campuses will be whitewashed, and upward mobility will not be possible in employment and other areas without these policies. And I said to myself, wait a minute, there was a black middle class in this country well before affirmative action policies were put in place in earnest in the 1970s. And it was growing at a much faster clip than it would grow in the era of affirmative action. So the myth, to answer your question, is that a black advancement in America is not possible and would never have occurred without racial preferences, without affirmative action, without racial favoritism, set-asides, quotas, and so forth. I set out to prove that wrong, to talk about what was going on in terms of incomes and home ownership rates and poverty rates and involvement with the criminal justice system and all those things in the decades prior to the implementation of these policies, and compare those outcomes to what has happened over the past 50 years of affirmative action. And that is what the book is about.
Yeah, I recently gave a presentation actually where I articulated what I thought of the three falsehoods that have dominated racial politics. First is this idea that racial preferences are necessary for Black people to succeed. Two is that racial disparities must mean the cause is racism. And third, equality of racial outcomes must supersede equality of opportunity. It feels like those three beliefs are the things that drive the perpetuation of things like race-based affirmative action.
Yeah, what was interesting about the talk around the ruling in 2023 was who it was coming from, and it was coming from a lot of upper income blacks, a lot of successful blacks, from a Barack Obama and Michelle Obama on down. Frankly, they were the ones denouncing the ruling. Your talking heads on cable news, your black academics. And one of the reasons, Ian, is that they are the ones who have primarily benefited from these policies. These policies are sold in the name of helping the black underclass, the black poor. But the reality is that it has been well-off blacks who have become better off under these policies. And that's the reason I believe many of them were so upset that these policies were going away. They've been the primary beneficiaries. And moreover, and I fault my industry, the media, for this, those black elites have gotten away with pretending that they speak for all black people when it comes to supporting these policies.
Yep.
Yet
Sure.
we know from a whole bunch of polling, including the polling surrounding the Supreme Court decision, that most black people do not support racial preferences and have not supported racial preferences. So these black elites are speaking for themselves, not for everyday black people. And that's something that I think the media in particular often loses sight of. Not just on affirmative action, frankly, but on a whole host of issues. School choice, for example, posed by black elites, supported by black rank and file. Voter ID laws, supported by blacks, opposed by black elites, and on and on and on. So this is yet another example of that phenomenon.
Jason, do you think that Barack Obama would have become president of the United States without affirmative action?
I don't know. That's obviously something you can't know for certain. He's a very talented politician. I would not have ruled it out. I do think that what Shelby Steele has called white guilt played a role in him being elected. He wasn't the most experienced politician. I thought, gave a good speech, but there wasn't a lot of substance to much of what he was saying. But we've subsequently had other presidents without much experience. So I don't think that's disqualifying anymore. So I don't know. I don't know the answer to that question.
This is another one you wouldn't know the answer to, but I just want to get your perspective. As I've read some of his quotes on affirmative action, sort of the largest and loudest quotes have always been in support of it. But I've also heard him say, George Stephanopoulos asked him at one point in 2007, do your daughters need affirmative action? And he basically said, no, they would be part of the advantaged group. Yeah. Do you think in his heart that he's actually almost somewhat satisfied that traditional affirmative action has ended?
No,
but he just doesn't verbalize it?
I think that was sort of a poll-tested response. Frankly, I think I think what he said after the decision came down was more heartfelt, and what he said at that time was, he said with a sort of sadness and resignation that policies that allowed people like me to feel like we belonged on college campuses or in certain spaces is going away, and he was quite remiss about sad about that. And so I think that was probably closer to his true feeling. I mean, I think that and I think both things can be true. He can say, I don't think my daughters need these policies, while he can also think that black people in general need them. Again, this is how these policies have been promoted over the decades, and so my problem with that, and as I try and lay out in the book, is not just that these policies, I believe, are unfair, unconstitutional, frankly, as we just learned. Not only do I think they're unwise in a society as racially diverse as ours for the government to be picking winners and losers based on race, or for public policy decisions to be based on race or ethnic background. I think that's sort of foolish in a politically, racially and ethnically diverse society.
Yeah.
And very divisive. So not only do I have those two problems with it, I also believe they don't work, that they have been counterproductive. and so that is probably where President Obama and I would really part ways. He would probably make an argument that these policies have in fact created or led to the expansion
Yeah.
of the black middle class. I would argue differently, that they have, if anything, throttled the expansion of the black middle class, and were never necessary to begin with.
I mean, I find it interesting, just as your point and counterproductive. There's kind of a conundrum amongst the so-called black elite who on one level concede some of the downsides of affirmative action while still supporting it. And back to the Obamas. So Michelle Obama is quoted of saying at her time when she was at Princeton, she said, quote, "It was impossible to be a black kid at a mostly white school and not feel the shadow of affirmative action. You could almost read the scrutiny in the gaze of certain students and even some professors, as if they wanted to say, 'I know why you're here.' These moments could be demoralizing, even if I'm sure I was just imagining some of it. It planted a seed of doubt."
Yeah, yeah, and I quote Thomas Sowell in the book. I quote from his memoir, where he talks about, because he's old enough to have lived in the pre-affirmative action
And achieved.
and achieved, and he says in his book, "I am not racked by these doubts." He considers himself lucky that he came along before these policies were put in place, because he doesn't have to he doesn't have to worry about what Michelle Obama is worrying about. And that is part of the problem with these policies, Ian, that they've taken a psychic toll, a psychological toll
Yes.
on
Yes.
blacks and whites alike. Among blacks, they make black advancement look suspicious. They make black achievement look suspect. And among blacks, there's this thinking: would I really have gotten here? Would we really have been there and achieved this and that? And that's part of the problem. And the Supreme Court in their majority opinion in Students for Fair Admissions v. Harvard get into the stereotyping that affirmative action perpetuates. If you're a white kid at Princeton, at an elite school, and the black people you encounter tend to be pooling at the bottom of the class, or tend to be dropping out at higher rates, or tend to be switching to easier majors, when you leave college and go out into the real world, what is your opinion of the capabilities of black people?
Oh, yes.
And that is a function of the mismatch effect of affirmative action. I don't know if Michelle Obama would have gotten into Princeton or Harvard Law School, I believe is where she graduated from as well, without affirmative action. I don't. It's unknowable. I know today that many of these elite schools take both kids who do meet the same requirements of other people admitted to the school, as well as kids who don't.
Mm-hmm.
And in fact, one of the best studies of this was done by an economist at Duke, who surveyed black freshmen at Duke and who wanted to study the natural sciences or economics. And it turns about 75% or so of black males entering Duke wanted to study one of those things, either the natural sciences or economics. But the attrition rate out of those fields by the time of graduation was something like 30-something percentage points.
So this is
only around a third, or only around 35%, managed to actually get a degree in the natural sciences or economics. Among white male freshmen, the attrition rate was 4 points.
Yeah.
And he concluded that the main factor in whether someone left the field they had originally wanted to study was whether that student had been admitted to Duke, that black student, under policies where they met the same standard as the other kids at the school, or whether they had been admitted under standards that had been lowered for them. The kids who had been lowered, they were the ones who were leaving those professions. The black kids that were admitted, that met the standards of the average kid at the school, did just fine and graduated. And that is so over the past 50 years, you've had white kids and Asian kids being matched with schools where they can thrive. You've had black kids being shoehorned into selective universities for cosmetic purposes, where they subsequently struggle, fall behind, leave the major they originally wanted to study, drop out altogether, you name it. And the real tragedy is that typically that black kid who's admitted to Duke, even with lower standards, has higher test scores than the average person taking the SAT among all races.
Yep.
They're just not as high as the average student at Duke. So you're taking a kid who would probably be hitting it out of the park academically at a slightly less selective university,
Well,
and making him struggle at Duke for cosmetic reasons, for window dressing, and that's the tragedy.
that is the tragedy. I mean, this is I hate this term, my lived experience, right? Because I went to Cornell College of Engineering. It was hard. I studied computer science engineering, and a number of my black classmates didn't finish. And it's not that they were bad people, and some of them very smart, but it was just really hard. But those students now leaving Cornell, leaving as if they felt they've failed, had they gone to a different school, could have been quite successful there. And that's the real life impact. I think a lot of people, just supporters of affirmative action, never want to really admit.
And before the Supreme Court ruled in 2023, we had a number of states, around 9 or 10 states, who had already done this on their own.
Yes, California.
They'd already banned affirmative action in college admissions. Big, diverse states: California, Texas, Florida, Arizona, Washington, Michigan. So we had some idea of what would happen after these policies went away. So out in California, which passed their ban back in the mid-90s, black enrollment at the most selective campuses in the system, Berkeley and UCLA, dropped. But black enrollment overall throughout the University of California system increased.
Right.
UC Riverside, UC Santa Cruz, and so forth. Not only did black enrollment throughout the system increase, black graduation rates increased. And not by a little bit. Black grade point averages increased. And not only did grade point averages and enrollment and graduation rates increase, so did graduation rates in the more difficult majors: math, science, engineering, and so forth. So what that tells me is that a policy, affirmative action, that had been put in place to increase the ranks of the black middle class had in practice been producing fewer black lawyers and doctors and engineers than we would have had in the absence of the policy. And that's why I say these policies are not only unconstitutional, unfair, silly in a pluralistic society in terms of having social cohesion, they're counterproductive.
Yep.
They're counterproductive.
Jason, speaking of California, how important was Ward Conley in this movement to end affirmative action?
He was huge. The ballot initiative in 1996, where the voters banned the policy, was spearheaded by Ward Conley, and then he went on to also, I think, lead efforts in other states to do the same thing, in Washington and Michigan, I believe, as well. So he's been huge in this movement, and largely successful. But he deserves a ton of credit for what he's done. Yeah.
So just going back to the Supreme Court case for a second, I always like to remind people that it was Sandra Day O'Connor in an affirmative action case, who said, I forget the exact year, but she said, "Look, we may need this set of policies, but in about 25 years, we should be done giving racial preferences on college campuses." I think her 25 years got us to maybe 2028 or something like that.
Yeah, I think that was from a 2003 decision. Yeah.
Yeah. So why do you think it is so hard for people? Because it's again, the advocates seem like there has to be this permanent solution of racial preferences, as if there will never be a day in which, in their view, structural racism, is not denying people. I just don't get
Well,
the.
I
It's
think they begin with a premise, with a false premise, and their premise is that, as you mentioned earlier, you touched on this earlier. Their premise is that anywhere we see racial disparities, the cause must be racism.
yeah,
There's no other plausible explanation. The natural order of things would be racial balance in outcomes, is the premise. And where they don't see it, they assume that something nefarious is going on. And so, so long as we continue to see racial disparities, and I'm of the belief that racial disparities are naturally occurring, and that racial balance in outcomes is utopian and has never been seen in any society down through history. So I think the problem is their premise. But by the way they're thinking, so long as we still have racial disparities, we will still need programs like affirmative action. So there is no end date
yeah,
for them, so long as those racial disparities are out there. But my point in the book is that if you are concerned about racial inequality, you should look at a time period when black-white racial inequality was narrowing. And it was narrowing in the decades leading up to affirmative action policies.
and that's exactly where I wanted to pivot to. It's like,
Yeah.
if we know now that affirmative action, the way it's been implemented, is a myth, and we know that there was this period of time before affirmative action, before civil rights legislation, before racial preferences were in place, then what explained the success of the Black community, that segment of the Black community that was rising? Because shouldn't that be what we're learning from?
Well, one thing I think blacks had going for them in the first 2/3 of the 20th century, before these policies were put in place in the late 60s and early 70s, is a strong nuclear family. And I think that had a lot to do, particularly with the economic advancement that you saw blacks making. So you had, the first 5 decades of the 20th century, you had black marriage rates were either equal or exceeding white marriage rates in this country. And blacks were increasing their years of education, both in absolute terms and relative to whites. Blacks were increasing their home ownership rates. Blacks were leaving poverty at unprecedented rates. But between 1940 and 1960, the black poverty rate fell by 40 percentage points, from 87% to 47% by 1960. That's not only before affirmative action and DEI policies and what have you. That's before the Civil Rights Act of 64,
Yep.
the Voting Rights Act of 65. It's before, not only before a black president, it's before the blacks had any kind of real political clout in this country. Long before the late 60s and 70s, where you would see black mayors of large black cities with black populations. Your Clevelands, or your Washington D.C.s, your Chicagos and Philadelphias and so forth. This is well before that. This is during peak Jim Crow. You're
Yep.
seeing this reduction, and I think a lot of it had to do with the strength of the black family at the time. And one reason we know this is because if you look at the convergence of black-white incomes that was occurring in the decades leading up to affirmative action, what was occurring in the 40s and 50s and 60s, black earnings as a percentage of white earnings was rising. In other words, white earnings were rising as well, but black earnings were rising faster. We were closing the gap. This starts to stall in the late 1960s. Right around the time you start to see a proliferation of single-parent homes in the black community. And just on a really basic economic level, it makes sense, because a single-parent home is probably going to be bringing in less money than a two-parent home. And so it was much more difficult for black families to compete with white families when it came to catching them and continuing that convergence in terms of household incomes. And so right there, you start to see problems setting in, trends start to develop, whether it's crime rates, whether it's educational stalling out. I cite an academic at Harvard, Robert Putnam, who wrote a book a couple of years ago talking about the convergence in college completion rates between blacks and whites that was occurring in the 50s and the 60s. It starts to stall out in 1970 to the point where college completion rates among blacks today are right about where they were in 1970 after 50 odd years of affirmative action in higher education. So, but whether the trend is income, poverty reduction, blacks entering skilled professions, home ownership rates, all of these things were moving in the right direction in the 40s and the 50s and the 60s. And all of them start to move to stall or to move in the wrong direction, starting in the 1970s, in particular, the late 60s and early 70s, right around the onset of affirmative action policies. So again, the argument that blacks were making faster progress in the decades prior to affirmative action is supported by a ton of data and evidence out there.
Jason, in terms of the early days of affirmative action, were there any policies or practices that you actually think had merit?
Oh, sure. And we should back up because people use the term affirmative action to mean very different things. And that can be part of the confusion when discussing the topic. In the book, I lay out very early how I'm using the term. I define it. So in the early days that you're talking about, affirmative action simply meant outreach to groups that had historically been overlooked in terms of employment, in terms of educational opportunities, and helping to bring those groups up to existing standards. What it became later is lowering standards to accommodate racial and ethnic groups that were lagging.
Right. Well, that's where equality of results over equality of opportunity.
And so in the early days, when affirmative action still meant simple outreach, I think blacks were doing much better in making faster. You know, I talk about some of the early policies that were put in place, and one dates back all the way to 1941 when FDR is president and issues an executive order because it's World War II. There's a labor shortage, and he says the defense industries, hiring in the defense industries, will now be colorblind. And he does this. He uses his wartime emergency powers to issue this executive order. Any company working in the defense industry must hire without regard to race. And I start part of the book. One of the chapters I start talk about blacks at the time, a group of black women in particular, who were able to take advantage of this and go work for the federal government and the agency that later became NASA. And these are women in the 1940s and 50s and 60s that helped put a man on the moon. These were black mathematicians. And I quote from a book that a woman wrote about that later became a movie, Hidden Figures. Mm-hmm. And the author of the book notes that when these women went out to take advantage of those new opportunities that had been generated by this executive order, no one had to lower any standards for them. They met the existing standards. So FDR's executive order was affirmative action in the sense of expanding opportunities to groups that had previously been denied opportunities, but it was not a lowering of standards to bring blacks onto the job or into the workforce. And that's the difference. Later on, in later decades, that would not be the case. It would all be about lowering those standards to achieve what today we call equity in outcomes or racial balance in outcomes, to achieve a certain quotas and set-asides and numerical goals would be put in place, and on and on. Even though a lot of the legislation, a lot of the debate in Congress about these policies explicitly ruled that out, said that this is going to be about color blindness. It is not going to be about racial balance in outcomes, that kids should be allowed into schools without regard to race, that blacks should be allowed into the workplace without regard to race. That would later be twisted by what today we call the administrative state, federal bureaucrats, and then blessed by the courts to change or manipulate that language to mean the complete opposite of what it was originally intended to mean. And that's what gets you to today's affirmative action: quotas, set-asides, racial preferences. Yeah.
I mean, what's so frustrating is that it's not as if there wasn't a big warning signal back in the mid 1960s. It's 2025. It's the 60th anniversary of the Patrick Moynihan report, on the state of the Black family. And most people don't recognize Chapter 1 of that report is called, the Great Negro American Revolution. That basically is saying there's all this incredible progress that's being made, but it's at risk.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, and he points to the fact that the non-marital black birth rate in the Black community then was 23.6%. Wouldn't we kill for that today?
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
But so what do you think is preventing? Because that report was written. If that report had been taken seriously and really acted upon, that there's lots of progress in the Black community, but it's in danger.
Yeah.
But he was accused of, quote, blaming the victim.
Yeah, and two things on that. One is he was speaking from experience. He was the product of a single parent home. His father had abandoned the family. He knew the consequences of these things firsthand. That is Moynihan. Secondly, he was relying on the scholarship of Black intellectuals when he wrote that report. People like E. Franklin Frazier, the University of Chicago sociologist, were the people he was citing. That was the evidence he was relying on. So it wasn't as though this white Labor Department employee came up with this stuff to just badmouth Black people. Within the Black community, there was concern about the trends he was describing. And he, in fact, relied on Black scholarship to report those trends. What this gets us to today, and I think it's a sign of the problem in areas, not just with regard to affirmative action, but discussions of race in general, is I think there's a lot of intellectual cowardice going on right now. It's not as if people don't know these studies are out there, or that people aren't familiar with this literature. These topics are just too taboo for intellectuals to discuss. And there was a book out a couple years ago called "The Two-Parent Privilege" by an economist named Melissa Carney, at MIT-trained economist. There you go. And she talks in that book, as well as in some interviews promoting the book, about the reaction of colleagues when they found out what she was working on. And she says, well, I run in left-wing intellectual circles, and when they found out I was writing a book that simply laid out all the evidence we have that kids who are raised in two-parent homes fare much better in life outcomes, they were aghast. They said, you should not write about this issue. You'll sound like a conservative. You don't want to be associated with people who focus on that sort of thing. These are people who spend their entire careers studying income inequality. But you are not allowed to talk about the role of family formation, the role that family formation plays in determining income inequality. You can't talk about that. This is what Carney is saying. And this will get you ostracized.
Yep.
So you have to talk about what the government, that we need a bigger welfare state, or we need to invest more money in this program or that program. You can't talk about how the decision to raise a child alone, to not get married, absent father. You cannot talk about how that is impacting income inequality. It's taboo, and that's a problem. That's a big problem. We've seen it since the days of Moynihan. It sort of ebbed and flowed, but the social justice left today certainly does not want to talk about it. There was a period, I think, back in the early 2000s, you saw some academics that would go there. Orlando Patterson of Harvard comes to mind. William Julius Wilson comes to mind. They were talking about it, but today, the left, the Democratic left is really in the control of a more progressive type of intellectual, and they don't want to talk about this at all.
Right. Well, of course, the irony, the tragedy, is that when Moynihan wrote the report, the non-marital birth rate in the Black community was 23.6%. Now it's 70, but it's also 30% in the white community, right? Higher
Right.
than
Right.
it was than in the Black community. So now
Yeah.
our ignoring of this obvious fact is hurting young people and families across race.
And the other thing to keep in mind here is the evidence we have. Again, this is all undermines the racial narrative they prefer to put forward that says income inequality is a product of racism, white supremacy, not family formation.
Right.
But we know that's not true. And one of the ways we know that's not true is because, and I cite some of this evidence in the book, but two-parent Black families, Black couples, Black married couples, their poverty rate's in the single digits, and it has been for the better part of 40 years in this country. In fact, there are some years when the Black poverty rate for married couples is not only lower than Blacks as a whole, it's lower than whites as a whole in this country. I mean, it makes, and we all know that racists aren't giving married people a break in terms of discriminating against them. So, and there's also other evidence to show that these disparities are a function of something other than race, or things other than race probably matter. Some other data I point to in the book shows that, and again, this sort of counters the sort of white supremacy argument out there. According to the 2020 census, Chinese Americans, Korean Americans, Japanese Americans, Indian Americans all out-earn white people. So that alone is problematic for people pushing the white supremacy narrative. There are also more than 9 million Black Americans that earn more than the white median in this country. I guess 9 million plus Black Americans somehow slipped through the cracks of the white supremacy edifice in America today. But there's another very interesting statistic that that Thomas Sowell has pointed to, and that I cite in the book. And he cites and it tells you how long race has not primarily been the issue in terms of Black upward mobility in this country. You go back to W.E.B. Du Bois's Philadelphia Negro, published in 1899 or something, well over 125 years ago. In that book, Du Bois says, if Black people, or if white people, he says, would somehow lose their prejudices overnight, he said it might help a few Black people here or there advance economically, but the vast majority of Blacks, he said, it would not have much of an impact on them. This is a guy one generation out of slavery who's already concluded that the primary problem is not how white people are treating Black people. It's the development of Black human capital, work habits, behaviors, attitudes that are conducive to upward mobility. He was saying that more than 125 years ago. Sowell sort of updates that with some more recent data that we have. And one of the things he points to is, again, this is census data, is that in many years, recent years, the poorest county in America has been located in rural Kentucky. And it's 99% white. Mm-hmm. And the median household incomes in this poor county in Kentucky are less than half of the white median nationwide. But here's the kicker. The incomes in this all-white community, where of course no racism exists, are also thousands of dollars less than the Black median nationwide in this country. So this doesn't mean racism doesn't exist or doesn't matter at all, but you can get income inequality with no racism.
Absolutely.
So the idea that that is what is driving income inequality or racial inequality in terms of incomes in this country, I think is undermined by data like that. But again, it's not data that the left wants to highlight. In fact, they want to ignore it because it undermines their narrative that you can use this racism as a blanket explanation for income inequality or any other kind of inequality in America today.
Jason, as I mentioned at the beginning of our conversation, you were a very popular guest, and I looked at the comments from 3 years ago when you were first on the show, and we're so grateful for you to come back. And one of the comments that really struck me, I'm just going to read it from one of our viewers. I have often worried, who is worthy of assuming Thomas Sowell's mantle? Jason Riley is one of those scholars, and then the person asks, who else? So I want to ask you, who else?
I demur on that one. No, Sowell is sui generis. He's going to be 95 at the end of June. He's still at it, and no, we won't live to see another Sowell. He's been hugely impactful. I'm a journalist. I call people like Sowell on the phone. I ask them questions. I write down what they say. It is not rocket science, but people like that are putting in the hard work and the data, and he has spent a lifetime addressing these issues that we've been talking about today, and no one has done it better. One of the really interesting things I came across in researching this book is that preferential policies, racial preferences, they not only have not worked for blacks in terms of helping them move up, they haven't worked for whites either. Not here in America, and they haven't worked in other countries where the majority, in this case in America it's whites, but anywhere where the majority has put in place affirmative action to help the majority. So if you go back to the Jim Crow era, obviously during that time whites were out earning blacks. But during the Jim Crow era, it's not like white Southerners got some huge boost in economic advancement under Jim Crow. Not with respect to blacks in the South, and not with respect to whites in the North. Jim Crow did not do much to help white Southerners, even though it gave them an advantage in hiring, employment, income. It didn't do much. If you go to other countries where the majority population have put in place policies to help the majority, like Malaysia, where the Malays obviously are the majority, they have laws in place in terms of who gets into universities, who can work in certain professions, that advantage the Malays over the ethnic Chinese, who are the minority. The ethnic Chinese out-earn and outperform the Malays and have for decades, even though these policies are in place. So it's just to say that these types of policies that have been put in place to help blacks in America have not helped anybody anywhere do the things that their supporters tell us they will do in America. And Sowell's always been excellent at bringing in that international perspective. A lot of times we discuss these issues only as they apply in America, but America, of course, is not a very old country. And a lot of these things have been tried in other countries many times before down through history. And it's worth looking at how they fared where else they've been tried. And affirmative action policies do not have a very good track record.
Yep. So as we come in for a landing, I'd love to get your take on people who are actually in earnest trying to address this problem without using racial preferences. I'm not sure if you're familiar with University of Austin at Texas. They've just announced new admissions criteria for their university. It used to be like most other universities, they took essays, they looked at high school GPA, and they came to the conclusion that all these things are gameable. The essays could be generated
Extracurricular activities.
Yeah, extracurricular or grade inflation. So they've come out with criteria that says if a student scores, I believe it's a 1580 on the SAT or a certain score on the ACT, or a certain score on something called the CLT, which is the classical learning test, if you if you cross one of those three thresholds, you're automatically in,
Yeah.
regardless of anything else.
Yeah. Yeah.
What do you think about that? And I want to talk about what some other folks are thinking, but what do you think about that purely standardized test?
You froze up on me,
Same for me.
Ian.
It records all sides of it, but Ian, you froze. We lost the last 6 seconds of what you were saying.
Oh, that's
So
funny.
what do I think of this University of Texas?
Yeah,
I applaud it. I applaud it, frankly, and I would certainly err on that side, in terms of moving forward away from racial preferences. And the reason is because that is a focus on objective standards, and we know how untrustworthy schools have been when we've allowed them to use subjective standards, holistic reviews, personality tests, and so forth. Anytime they can move away from test scores, GPAs, objective measures, they will allow those subjective measures to crowd out objectivity. So I applaud the schools move in that direction, and I think other schools should also move in that direction. I'd support that.
yeah. And then what about those who say, okay, if you don't like race-based affirmative action, let's have class-based affirmative action?
Well, it's the same. It's the same problem, which is to say that class can be a very slippery term. How are you defining class? Is it just going to be family income? No, it won't. It won't be. They'll get into oh, did you come from a high poverty neighborhood or go to a high poverty school? It's not just your family's income that we're going to worry about. And again, this is all going to move away because class will be used as a proxy for race, and so if we allow them to do that, and I don't think they should be allowed to do that. The other problem with the class approach, Ian, is it doesn't solve the mismatch problem. The mismatch problem. Remember, we know that the most important thing for a student upon entering an institution is that their preparation match the preparation of the average person at that institution. Whenever there is a gap between the preparation of that entering student and those other kids at the school, that entering student is likely to have more problems. Whether that entering student is a child of alumni, whether that entering student is a gifted athlete, they're on a sports scholarship, whether it's a child of a donor, it doesn't matter. If Harvard admitted left-handed redheads with SAT scores 300 points below those of the average student admitted to Harvard, you would see left-handed redheads pooling at the bottom of the class, dropping out at higher rates, switching to easier majors, and so forth. So class-based affirmative action does not solve that problem. The important thing is still that the student needs to be able to handle the work at that institution. The other problem that the folks pushing class-based affirmative action will have is that it won't get them the racial diversity that they want, because there's a pool problem. There's a serious pool problem. These elite schools, when you're talking about the Ivy Leagues or your Dukes and Stanfords, the Ivy Plus schools, I guess they call them, you're looking at a 1,400 SAT score minimum for these schools. In 2023, I think is the most recent data I saw, among students who took the SAT and scored 1,400 or higher, 25% were Asian. Around 5 or 6% were white. 1% was black.
Yes, I'm familiar with this data.
So, and the other problem you have is that even among low-income students, low-income non-whites, or I'm sorry, low-income non-black students, non-income Asians, low-income whites, tend to outperform low-income blacks. So all of these class-based affirmative action slots could easily be filled by poor whites
Yep.
who outperform poor blacks, or poor Asians who outperform poor whites. So it just won't get them the diversity that they want, which is why they're going to switch to a very subjective definition of underprivileged or impoverished or poor, and again they'll just play around with the definition in order to get the right racial mix that they're looking for. So I don't think class affirmative action is the way to go.
So let me ask you my final question, because you just hit on something. I think a lot of these college administrators want to end up with what they view is a racially diverse population of kids at their institution, even if across institutions you could get that diversity. And so I'm just curious, what do you say to those people that you're right? If we just went with SAT scores, I'd have a disproportionate number of Asian students, maybe no Black students, maybe some number of Hispanic students. What do you say to those people that who genuinely value racial diversity or other kinds of diversity, but if you go solely by these objective measures, you're almost guaranteed not to get that?
I think they need to change their priorities. The purpose of a higher education, the purpose of a college education, should be to admit students who will get the most out of the experience. And what is the point of flunking out of MIT and instead of graduating from the University of Massachusetts? What is the point of flunking out of Michigan instead of graduating from Michigan State?
Yeah.
This is crazy. I mean, these Black kids are not there to provide window dressing for these elite schools.
No, that's for sure.
And they're turning these kids into artificial failures. There was a study done of students at MIT some years ago that showed that Black students scored in the 90th percentile. Black students at MIT that had been admitted to MIT scored in the 90th percentile of the math portion of the SAT test among all kids in the country. But among their peers at MIT, they were in the 10th percentile. So they were flunking out at higher numbers, switching to easier majors. Again, what is the point of flunking out of MIT? Sometimes the argument is made that, well, Jason, they're smart, they're in the 90th percentile. MIT's a better school, so they're going to get a better education. And they might struggle a little bit, but they're going to be going to a better school. Where there have been some studies of this done as well. I cite some of them in the book. And the example, one of the studies found that Black students, they compared Black students who had been admitted to Howard Law School in Washington, D.C., the historically Black college, which does not use racial preferences. And they compared those Black students to Black students who had been admitted to George Mason University, which is a higher ranked law school that does use racial preferences to admit Blacks. It compared Black graduates of both schools and how they did on their first attempt at passing the bar exam. Black graduates of Howard Law School passed the bar on the first try at around 57%. Their counterparts at George Mason University, their Black counterparts, passed the bar at around 33%. So did those Black students who had been let into George Mason University under affirmative action policies get a better education than the Black kids who went to Howard, where they met the standards of the other students at Howard and did just fine? So this argument that, we'll just give these kids some remedial classes freshman year to make up the difference. I mean, Ian, K through 12. You are starting this conversation way too far downstream.
Absolutely.
You are not going to make up for 12 years of elementary and secondary school education with a few remedial classes freshman year at Duke University. Yep. It's not happening. And so what are we doing here? I appreciate the aesthetic sensibilities of people who want to see the white kid sitting next to the Black kid sitting next to the Asian kid sitting next to the Indian. But what are we trying to do here? Are we trying to educate kids
Yep.
or design the perfect college catalog.
Make a Benetton ad.
I mean, yeah. So, I would tell that person, I disagree with your priorities and the purpose of higher education.
All right. Wow. Well, Jason, as always, I encourage everyone to go out and get a copy of the Affirmative Action Myth. And while you're doing that, some of his prior books are pretty good too.
Thank you, guys. Thank
Yeah.
you, Nique.
Well,
Thank you,
Jason,
Ann.
thank you very much, and thank you for being a beacon, because your voice is it's rare, and I hope that this book gets the traction and attention that it deserves.
Me too.
All right. So with that, Nique, any parting words?
No, other than I'll be purchasing my book today, and I can't wait to read it, sincerely. And it'll also be passed along to my older children. It's a very important read.
Yes.
Okay. Good
All right.
to hear.
Thank you to our listeners. Thank you for listening to another episode of The Invisible Men. To see any other episodes, you can go to www.invisible.men, or you can listen to wherever you hear your podcasts. Gentlemen, thank you for a great session. Onward.